The gunslinger helped a crying bride flee her wedding. That night, her brothers returned with rifles. The blood on Jake Morrison's boots was still fresh when he heard the crying. Not the kind of tears that come from scraped knees or broken toys, but the deep soul-wrenching sobs that only emerge when hope dies completely. He had been washing his hands in the creek behind St. Matthew's Chapel, trying to scrub away the evidence of what he had done 3 towns over, when the sound cut through the evening air like a blade. The year was 1874, and the Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly under a sky painted crimson by the setting sun. Dust devils danced across the barren landscape, carrying whispers of violence and broken promises that seemed to follow Jake wherever his horse took him. He had learned long ago that crying women meant trouble, but something about this particular sound made him pause, his weathered hands dripping creek water as he listened. Through the chapel's stained glass windows, he could see the silhouette of a woman in white, her shoulders shaking with each sob. The irony was not lost on him that he, a man who had sent 17 souls to their Maker, was standing outside God's house listening to someone else's pain. But Jake Morrison had never been one to ignore suffering, even when logic screamed at him to mount his horse and ride toward the horizon. The chapel door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see her clearly now. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with auburn hair that caught the last rays of sunlight streaming through the windows. Her wedding dress was exquisite, the kind that cost more than most men earned in a year, but it was torn at the hem and stained with dirt. She sat alone in the front pew, her face buried in her hands, completely unaware that death itself was watching her from the shadows. Jake had seen enough brides in his time to know when one was happy and when one was trapped. This woman wore her despair like a second skin, and every instinct he possessed told him to walk away. But his boots carried him forward anyway, each step echoing through the empty chapel like a countdown to disaster. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and she looked up with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. They were green, the color of sage after rain, and filled with a terror that had nothing to do with his sudden appearance. She should have been afraid of him, this stranger with blood under his fingernails and death in his reputation. But instead, she seemed almost relieved. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, leaving streaks across her pale cheeks. Her wedding ring caught the light, a golden band that seemed to weigh heavier than iron shackles. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a woman who had reached the end of her endurance. She told him her name was Catherine Whitmore, and she had just fled her own wedding ceremony, not because she had changed her mind about love, but because she had finally understood what kind of man her father had promised her to. The groom was Marcus Brennan, a cattle baron whose reputation for cruelty extended far beyond his business dealings. Stories followed him like vultures, tales of workers who disappeared after asking for fair wages, of women who learned too late that his charm was merely a mask for something far darker. Catherine had discovered the truth just hours before the ceremony when she overheard her future husband discussing his plans for their wedding night with his men, describing her as if she were livestock to be broken. Jake listened without interrupting, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of his Colt revolver. He had killed men for less than what Catherine was describing, but this situation was different. This was not about justice or revenge, but about a young woman whose life hung in the balance between 2 impossible choices: submit to a monster or flee into a world that offered no safety for women alone. The chapel grew darker as night fell, and somewhere in the distance, Jake could hear the sound of horses approaching. Catherine heard them too, and the color drained from her face like water from a broken basin. She knew, as Jake knew, that Marcus Brennan was not the kind of man who would let a bride escape without consequences. Jake made his decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He had spent years running from his past, trying to outride the ghosts that haunted his dreams, but this was different. This was a chance to be something other than the weapon he had become, to protect instead of destroy. He told Catherine to gather anything she could carry and be ready to move. His horse was fast, bred for long distances and hard riding, and he knew trails through the mountains that would take them far from Marcus Brennan's reach. She looked at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if she could not quite accept that salvation had walked through the chapel door wearing dusty leather and carrying death on his hip. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, accompanied by voices that carried the harsh edge of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Jake moved to the window and peered through the stained glass, counting at least 6 riders in the moonlight. Marcus Brennan sat tall in his saddle, his face a mask of cold fury that promised violence for anyone who had dared to interfere with his plans. Catherine gathered her few possessions with trembling hands, her wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves in a grave wind. She had no money, no family who would help her, and no skills that would keep her alive in a world that devoured the weak without mercy. But she also had nothing left to lose, and sometimes that was the most dangerous thing of all. Jake helped her through the chapel's back window, his hands steady despite the chaos building in his chest. He had been in countless gunfights, had faced down men who were faster and meaner than him, but this felt different. This time, he was not fighting for money or reputation, but for something infinitely more precious and fragile. They moved through the darkness like shadows, Catherine's white dress ghostly in the moonlight as they made their way to where Jake's horse waited. The animal was a magnificent black stallion named Thunder, trained to respond to the slightest pressure from his rider's knees and capable of covering ground that would kill lesser horses. Jake lifted Catherine onto Thunder's back, her weight almost nothing against his strength, and swung up behind her. She leaned back against his chest, and he could feel her heart hammering like a trapped bird. The scent of her hair filled his nostrils, something clean and sweet that reminded him of better times and simpler choices. They rode hard through the night, following deer paths and cattle trails that wound through the mountains like ancient secrets. Thunder's hooves struck the rocky ground with a rhythm that matched Jake's heartbeat, each stride carrying them further from the life Catherine had known and deeper into an uncertain future. Behind them, Marcus Brennan and his men spread out across the territory like a plague, their lanterns bobbing through the darkness as they searched every barn, every cabin, every hiding place where a desperate woman might seek shelter. But Jake knew these mountains better than most men knew their own names, and he guided Thunder along routes that would leave no trail for even the best tracker to follow. As dawn broke over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, they stopped beside a hidden stream to rest. Catherine slid down from the horse with Jake's help, her legs shaking from exhaustion and fear. She knelt beside the water and cupped it in her hands, drinking deeply while Jake kept watch on the trail behind them. In the growing light, he could see her more clearly now. The wedding dress was ruined beyond repair, torn and stained from their desperate flight, but she wore it with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes held a determination that reminded Jake of why he had chosen to help her. She looked up at him as she finished drinking, water droplets clinging to her lips like morning dew. There was something in her expression that he had not seen before, a recognition that went beyond gratitude. She saw him not as the killer he had been, but as the man he might still become. They rested for only an hour before mounting Thunder again and continuing their journey deeper into the wilderness. Jake knew of a place where they would be safe, at least temporarily. A cabin built by a trapper who had disappeared years ago and left behind only bones and legends. It was 2 days hard riding through country that would challenge even experienced horsemen. But it offered something more valuable than gold: invisibility. The second night found them camped in a grove of aspen trees, their leaves whispering secrets in the mountain wind. Jake built a small fire, just enough to ward off the chill that came with altitude, and Catherine sat close to the flames with her arms wrapped around her knees. She had not complained once during their grueling journey, had not asked for rest or comfort, and Jake found himself respecting her more with each passing hour. She broke the silence with a question that cut straight to the heart of things. She asked him why he had helped her, what he stood to gain from interfering in the affairs of men like Marcus Brennan. Her voice was soft but steady, and Jake could hear the intelligence behind the words, the sharp mind that had recognized the danger in her situation and chosen to flee rather than submit. Jake stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. He told her about the men he had killed, about the reputation that followed him like a shadow, about the weight of choices that could never be undone. But he also told her about the moment in the chapel, when he had heard her crying and felt something stir inside him that he had thought was dead forever. Catherine listened without judgment, her green eyes reflecting the firelight as Jake spoke of things he had never shared with another living soul. When he finished, she reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and surprisingly strong. She told him that she understood what it meant to be trapped by circumstances beyond one's control, to be forced into roles that felt like prisons rather than choices. The third day brought them to the hidden cabin, a structure so weathered and overgrown that it seemed to have emerged from the mountain itself rather than being built by human hands. Jake checked the interior carefully before allowing Catherine to enter, his eyes scanning for signs of recent occupation or hidden dangers. The cabin was empty except for dust and memories, but it was sound and defensible, with a clear view of the approaches and water nearby. Catherine explored their temporary sanctuary with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take safety for granted. She found supplies left behind by the previous occupant, canned goods and ammunition that had remained preserved in the dry mountain air. There was even a change of clothes that would fit her, practical garments that would allow her to move more freely than her ruined wedding dress. That evening, as they shared a meal of canned beans and hardtack, Catherine asked Jake about his plans. She wanted to know if he intended to leave her at the cabin and continue on his way, or if he had something else in mind. Her question hung in the air like smoke from their fire, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to voice. Jake told her the truth. He did not know what came next. For years, his life had been defined by running, by staying one step ahead of the men who wanted him dead and the law that wanted him hanged. But something had changed during their flight from Marcus Brennan, something that made the idea of riding away alone seem impossible. Catherine nodded as if she had expected his answer. She told him that she had been thinking about the future as well, about what kind of life might be possible for a woman with no family and no money but plenty of determination. She had skills, she said, things she had learned despite her sheltered upbringing. She could read and write, could keep books and manage accounts, could even handle a rifle if taught properly. The conversation continued late into the night. Two people who had found themselves thrown together by violence and circumstance, trying to imagine a different kind of future. Jake found himself talking about dreams he had abandoned long ago, about the possibility of starting over in a place where his reputation had not yet poisoned the ground beneath his feet. But even as they planned and hoped, both of them knew that Marcus Brennan would not give up easily. The cattle baron's pride had been wounded as much as his plans had been disrupted, and men like him did not forgive insults to their honor. He would keep searching until he found them or until death made the search meaningless. The fourth day dawned gray and threatening, with clouds gathering around the mountain peaks like an army preparing for battle. Jake woke to the sound of distant thunder, but as he listened more carefully, he realized the sound was too regular, too rhythmic to be weather. It was the sound of horses moving at a steady pace, still far away but coming closer with each passing minute. He woke Catherine gently, his hand covering her mouth to prevent any sound that might carry on the mountain air. Her eyes opened immediately, alert and frightened but not panicked. She had learned quickly during their time together, adapting to danger with an instinct that impressed Jake even as it saddened him to see innocence replaced by necessity. They gathered their few possessions in silence, every movement careful and deliberate. Jake checked his weapons while Catherine rolled their blankets and secured their supplies. They had prepared for this possibility, had discussed what they would do if Marcus Brennan's men found their trail. But knowing what to do and being ready to do it were different things entirely. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and now Jake could hear voices as well. Men calling to each other across the wilderness with the confidence of those who believed they held all the advantages. He counted at least 8 riders, possibly more, far too many for him to face in open combat, even with every advantage of terrain and surprise. Jake made the decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of running deeper into the mountains, he would make a stand here at the cabin. The structure was solid enough to provide cover, and the approach was narrow enough that attackers would have to come at them in small groups rather than all at once. Most importantly, it would give Catherine a chance to escape if things went badly. He explained his plan quickly and quietly, watching her face as she understood what he was proposing. She argued at first, insisting that they should flee together as they had planned, but Jake was firm. This was his fight now, had been from the moment he chose to help her in the chapel. She had given him something he had not felt in years, a reason to stand and fight rather than simply survive. Catherine finally agreed, but on one condition: she would not run until she was certain Jake could not hold them off alone. She had found a rifle among the cabin supplies and knew enough about shooting to be useful. They would make their stand together, at least until the odds became absolutely hopeless. The voices were close now, close enough that Jake could make out individual words. Marcus Brennan was indeed leading the group, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to getting his way through violence and intimidation. He was promising his men a substantial reward for Catherine's return and an even larger one for Jake's death. Jake positioned himself at the cabin's front window while Catherine took the back, both of them with clear fields of fire and adequate cover. The waiting was the hardest part, those final minutes before violence erupted and changed everything forever. Jake had been in this situation before, but never with so much at stake, never with someone else's life depending on his skill and luck. Marcus Brennan appeared first, riding into the small clearing in front of the cabin with the supreme confidence of a man who had never lost a fight. He was everything Catherine had described and more, a large man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth that seemed permanently twisted into a sneer. Behind him came his brothers, Thomas and William Brennan, both carrying rifles and wearing expressions that promised suffering for anyone who had dared to cross their family. The cattle baron called out to the cabin, his voice echoing off the mountain walls as he demanded Catherine's immediate surrender. He promised that no harm would come to her if she walked out willingly, but his tone suggested that harm would definitely come to anyone who continued to shelter her. Jake had heard similar promises before and knew exactly how much they were worth. When no response came from the cabin, Marcus Brennan's patience evaporated like morning mist. He gestured to his men, spreading them out in a rough semicircle around the structure while keeping himself and his brothers in positions where they could direct the assault. The moment had come when words would give way to bullets and blood. Jake took careful aim at Marcus Brennan through the cabin window, his finger steady on the trigger of his Colt. The range was perfect, the target clear, and he had made more difficult shots under worse conditions. But something made him hesitate, some instinct that warned him the situation was not quite what it appeared to be. That hesitation saved his life as Thomas Brennan's rifle cracked from an unexpected angle, the bullet splintering wood inches from Jake's head. The brothers had been more clever than he had anticipated, sending men around to flank the cabin while keeping him focused on the obvious threat in front. Now bullets were coming from 3 directions at once, turning the cabin into a deadly trap rather than a defensible position. Jake rolled away from the window as more shots shattered the glass, splinters of wood and fragments of lid filling the air where he had been standing. From the back of the cabin, he could hear Catherine's rifle answering the attack, her shots careful and deliberate rather than panicked. She was holding her own, at least for now, but they were badly outnumbered and their position was becoming more precarious with each passing second. The battle that followed was fierce and desperate, a deadly dance played out in smoke and thunder while the mountain walls echoed with the sounds of violence. Jake moved from window to window, never staying in one place long enough for the attackers to get a clear shot, his return fire precise and deadly. 2 of Marcus Brennan's men fell in the first few minutes, their bodies testimony to Jake's skill with the weapons that had made him legendary. But there were still too many of them, and ammunition was not infinite. Jake could hear the bullets eating away at the cabin's walls, each shot weakening their shelter and bringing their enemies closer to victory. Catherine continued to fire from the back window, her shots becoming more frantic as the attackers pressed their advantage. The end came suddenly, as it always did in such situations. A bullet found its mark, spinning Jake around and sending him crashing to the cabin floor with blood spreading across his shirt. Catherine screamed his name and rushed to his side, abandoning her rifle and her position to kneel beside the man who had risked everything to save her. Jake looked up into her face, seeing tears streaming down her cheeks as she pressed her hands against his wound. The bullet had taken him high in the shoulder, painful but not immediately fatal if he could get proper treatment. But proper treatment was not available in a mountain cabin surrounded by men who wanted him dead. Marcus Brennan's voice called out again, demanding surrender and promising that Catherine would not be harmed if she came out immediately. This time, the threat was accompanied by the smell of smoke as the attackers began to set fire to the cabin's exterior walls. They would burn Jake and Catherine out if they could not shoot them out. Catherine looked at Jake with eyes that held a lifetime of unspoken words. She told him that she would not let him die for her sake, that his sacrifice had already given her more than she had any right to expect. Before Jake could protest, she was moving toward the cabin door, her hands raised in surrender as she prepared to face whatever Marcus Brennan had planned for her. Jake tried to stop her, tried to rise from the floor despite the pain that threatened to drag him into unconsciousness, but his body would not obey his will. He could only watch as Catherine walked toward the door that would take her back to the life she had fled, back to the man whose cruelty had driven her to desperate flight. But Catherine had one more surprise left, one final act of courage that would change everything. As she reached for the door handle, she suddenly spun around and grabbed Jake's rifle from where it had fallen. In one smooth motion, she threw open the door and stepped outside, the weapon leveled at Marcus Brennan's chest. The cattle baron had been expecting a broken, defeated woman, not the fierce warrior who confronted him in the doorway of the burning cabin. His moment of surprise was all Catherine needed. Her shot took him square in the chest, sending him tumbling from his horse to lie still on the mountain earth. The death of their leader stunned Marcus Brennan's men into momentary inaction, and that moment was all Jake needed. Despite his wound, he forced himself to his feet and joined Catherine in the doorway, his Colt speaking with deadly accuracy as he cut down 2 more attackers before they could react. The remaining men, faced with the sudden reversal of fortune and the deaths of their employer and several companions, chose discretion over valor. They wheeled their horses around and fled into the mountains, leaving behind their dead and their wounded pride. The battle was over as suddenly as it had begun. Catherine helped Jake outside, where they watched the Brennan brothers' surviving men disappear into the wilderness like smoke on the wind. The immediate threat was over, but both of them knew that word would spread about what had happened here. Jake Morrison's reputation would grow even larger. Then Catherine Whitmore would be known as the woman who had killed Marcus Brennan. They stood together in the mountain clearing, surrounded by the bodies of men who had come to drag them back to a life neither of them wanted. The cabin burned behind them, consuming the temporary shelter that had become a battlefield, but neither of them looked back. The past was finished now, burned away with Marcus Brennan's ambitions and the old fears that had driven them both. Jake's wound needed attention, and they would have to find new shelter before the mountain cold set in for the night. But for the first time since they had met in the chapel, the future held more promise than threat. They had faced the worst that Marcus Brennan could throw at them and emerged victorious, scarred but alive and free to choose their own path. As they walked away from the burning cabin, Catherine slipped her hand into Jake's uninjured one. Neither of them spoke about what would happen next, about where they would go or what they would do. Those were decisions for another day, problems to be solved when the immediate crisis had passed. What mattered now was that they were alive, that they had chosen to stand together when the moment of ultimate testing came, and that the blood on the mountain earth belonged to their enemies rather than themselves. The gunslinger and the fleeing bride had become something more than the sum of their separate fears and desperate choices. They had become partners in the truest sense, bound together by shared danger and mutual sacrifice. Jake's wound would heal, leaving only another scar to join the collection he already carried. Catherine's wedding dress would be replaced by practical clothes that suited her new life as an outlaw's companion. 3 weeks later, they rode into a small town in Colorado where no one knew their names or their story. Jake found work as a deputy marshal, his reputation with a gun more asset than liability in a place that valued quick justice over complicated questions. Catherine opened a small school, teaching children to read and write while keeping one eye on the horizon for trouble that might follow them. They never spoke of marriage, but they wore matching gold bands that Catherine had fashioned from coins Jake earned protecting the town's bank from raiders. The preacher who blessed their union asked no questions about their past, understanding that some stories were better left buried in mountain graves. The Brennan name faded from memory like smoke and wind, and Marcus Brennan's empire crumbled without his iron hand to hold it together. His surviving men scattered to other territories, carrying with them whispered warnings about the gunslinger who had chosen love over money and the bride, who had chosen freedom over safety. Jake Morrison hung up his guns 5 years later, trading leather and steel for land and livestock. Catherine bore him 2 children, a boy with his father's steady hands and a girl with her mother's fierce green eyes. They built a life from determination and second chances, proving that even the most unlikely love could bloom in soil watered with blood and tears. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the mountain wind whispered through the valley they now called home, Jake and Catherine would sit on their porch and remember the night that changed everything. The chapel where they first met had burned down years ago, struck by lightning and consumed by flames that some said looked like divine judgment. But neither of them mourned its loss. They had found their sanctuary in each other, built their cathedral from shared trust and mutual protection. The crying bride had found her salvation in the most unlikely place, and the gunslinger had discovered that some things were worth fighting for that had nothing to do with money or reputation. Their story became legend in the territory, told around campfires and in saloons by men who claimed to have known them personally. Most of the details were wrong, exaggerated by distance and time until Jake became a giant among men and Catherine an angel of vengeance. But the heart of the story remained true. Sometimes love was worth killing for, and sometimes the most dangerous thing a man could do was show mercy to a woman in tears.